Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos, and today we're going to take a look at the new Titanforging system. So these items are called corrupted items. They're coming in patch 8.3, and it's unclear how long this system is going to stay. It might only be for this one patch, because it's pretty thematic to N'Zoth and stuff, which is the focus of the patch. So the source for all this information is in 3 Wowhead articles, which will be linked in the description of this video if you'd like to read them yourself. So the way it works is that when an item drops, instead of Titanforging a random amount of item levels, an item can become corrupted when it drops. And so corruption is a negative thing in red, so an amount of a corruption stat shows up on the item. And in green, you get a bonus like benthic items have that give you some positive effect. Some of them are defensive, some of them are offensive. And we'll go through all of the different effects in a bit, but some of them are really strong here, the corrupted item bonuses, like increasing the amount of a stat that you get from all sources by a percentage, or your spells and abilities have a chance to grant you a flash of clarity, reducing the cooldown of your next 3 spells cast by 2 seconds. That'll be really strong for some specs like Fire Mage, for instance. So that looks pretty cool. Or the big one, increases the damage you deal with critical strikes by X%. We saw this on the benthic boots in patch 7.2, patch 8.2 rather, and that was really, really powerful. So I expect this one is generally going to be the best one for most specs. Now, the corruption stat does negative things for you. The more corruption you get, the more bad things happen, and it also scales up the effect of these bad things. So you're going to need to be careful with the amount of corruption you get. We'll go through all of the different effects of corruption, but one thing that's worth noting is you can also gain corruption resistance. It looks like that'll be from a legendary cloak that we're going to be able to get and upgrade as the expansion progresses. And there are some essences that come with corruption resistance as well in the new patch. So you may want to slot those in so that you have corruption resistance. The way it looks like corruption resistance is going to work is that your corruption minus your corruption resistance is going to equal your total corruption. So it's basically, you'll get to wear that much corruption for free before you start seeing negative effects. There's also some effects on your character here. You can see you start looking kind of weird as you get corrupted, which is pretty cool. So let's start by going through the exact way that these items roll. When an item rolls, it will roll in tier 1, 2, or 3. And the higher tiers come with more corruption and also more powerful positive effects. So it's not like there's a complete like RNG. It's not like you can roll an item with very low corruption and a very powerful effect. The items with more corruption are going to have the more powerful effects. But within each tier, there is a random amount of corruption. So there's a range of corruption you can get in that tier. And there's a range of, well, there's not a range, actually, yeah. So the tier, the positive effect does not have a range. The positive effects are just 3 different tiers that have an absolute value, and you're trying to roll a low amount of corruption, ideally, on this item. And the range is, it's about 5. It's 5 corruption ranges. So it's not huge, but 5 corruption across your whole gear, it'll be a lot better if you roll on the low end of this. So every time an item drops, it'll randomly choose which tier it is, which of these positive affixes it is, and which of the, like, where in this range of corruption the actual corruption amount will be. So there's a lot of RNG involved in this, but there are a lot of pretty cool effects here, and I think it'll actually lead to some interesting choices in itemization. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But let's start by just looking through the different effects that you can get on the items that are positive. So Avoidance is one of the effects you can get. Your Avoidance is increased by an amount equal to a percentage of your haste, scaling up here to 10% of your haste. This looks like a reasonable defensive benefit. The thing is that corruption itself comes with a pretty serious drawback, so I expect this is going to be a pretty unused... Like, it's tough to imagine that getting an avoidance equal to 10% of your haste is going to be worth taking on 20 to 25 corruption on an item, and I imagine you're going to want to use most of your corruption budget on more impactful things. The place I could see this particular benefit going is, like, if you're a tank spec and you're really looking to maximize your tankiness, and you have some corruption resistance, so you can take on some corruption for free, then you might be interested in picking up a little bit of this free avoidance here. However, I think that the more interesting, or the more powerful ones, even for tank specs, will be these 4 stat proc bonuses. Well, not proc, but stat bonuses. So increasing the amount of haste, mastery, crit, or verse you get from all sources by a percentage. This is really going to favor specs that go all in on one stat. So if you look now at the state of the game, there are some specs that, like, their gems are a bunch of different stats, and they're kind of trying to balance all their stats. Those specs are going to like these effects a lot less than specs that are just like, I want all the crit that I possibly can get, because that's going to scale, obviously, a lot better with this effect. So those will be the specs most interested in these affixes. Health regeneration, 20 to 40% of total health regeneration now continues during combat. Pretty minor here. Trolls have had this effect. Darkspear trolls have had this effect at 10%. It's tough to imagine this really doing much of anything. So again, this doesn't seem worth taking on corruption. Healing received increases your healing received from all sources by a percentage. This seems like a pretty good one for tanks if they have a way to mitigate the corruption or they don't care about taking on a little bit of corruption. Leech increased by a percentage. Healers might like this one. Healers like to get a lot of leech. I think it's pretty good for all specs kind of equally, but healers are the ones that care about their HPS the most, so they're the ones that, will look at this and think it's the most powerful. And then we get to the real big part here, the crit damage. Increase the damage you deal with critical strikes by 5 to 7%. So it's worth noting here that, like, this tier 1 is 5/7 as effective as the tier 3, right? It's pretty close to the same effectiveness as the tier 3, but it comes with a lot less corruption, right? If we look at the corrupted stat ranges here, you could get a tier 1 with only 5 corruption on it, and that'll give you 5% crit damage on that item. And if you want to go up to 7% crit damage, you'd need to move up to the 20 to 25 corruption range, right? So 5 to 10 is a lot less corruption than 20 to 25, right? For half as much corruption or less, you can get 5/7 of the value of the effect. So I think that's pretty good. I think that means that you'll be able to like if you really want to min-max your damage and go for the little bit of extra crit damage, you're going to be paying much, like you're getting a lot of diminishing returns here. The first 5% crit damage is really free, and the next 2% are going to cost you a lot of corruption. And then reduces your damage taken from periodic effects by 2 to 6%. This is another interesting one. Again, the defensive bonuses here are a little bit of a weird, it's in a little bit of a weird place, right, to get a defensive bonus on something that comes with a defensive drawback in the corruption. But this may be something interesting. It's unclear whether or not this will work on like Monk Stagger. If it does, that'd be pretty cool. That'd be a pretty big damage reduction just kind of across the board then to Brewmaster Monk. Flash of Clarity. Tier 3. The Flash of Clarity only appears at tier 3, and it's not got any, so there's no different tiers for it. Your spells and abilities have a chance to grant you a Flash of Clarity, reducing the cooldown of your next 3 spells cast by 2 seconds. So this will be pretty good for some specs that I could see this being good for, like Disciplined Priest, Fire Mage. I guess those are the main ones that spring to mind as really liking to, like, Fire Blasts or Radiances or whatever, reducing the cooldown on those. Yeah, we'll have to see. This one is exciting, right? The fact that it's only showing up at tier 3, it makes you think that it's going to be powerful. And this is a total of, what, 6 seconds of cooldown reduction every time it procs? We'll see what the proc rate's like. And it's interesting, because it's a proc, it's not something that's on use, like the bracers, the cloth bracers that have a similar effect. It'll be a lot less powerful than those, but still, those bracers are very, very powerful, so anything in that kind of space might be very good. So those are the positive effects, right? Now, what exactly does corruption do for you when you get it? Well, as soon as you get any corruption, so as long as you have 1 or more corruption, you're going to get the Grasping Tendrils debuff, which procs about once per minute. Taking damage has a chance to slow your movement speed for 5 seconds. The magnitude of the slow increases with further corruption. And the magnitude of the slow is always going to be, it starts at 10%, and it goes up by 1 for each corruption you have. So if you have 10 corruption, you're going to have a 20% slow when this procs. And if you're up at 90 corruption, then you're going to be fully slowed, right? You're going to be snared entirely whenever this does proc. Now, it is a magic debuff, so it can be dispelled off of you, which means that in a raiding setting, you may be able to get away with just running Grasping Tendrils and having it dispelled off you if it's at an important time. So this is not too bad, and there's not any further negative effects to corruption until you reach 20 corruption. Now, when you reach 20 corruption, some really bad stuff starts happening. You get the Corrupted Zone debuff, which also procs about once per minute. Your spells and abilities have a chance to create a corrupted zone at your location for 8 seconds, dealing shadow damage to you every 2 seconds. The size and damage of the zone increase with higher corruption. The damage per tick of the zone looks like it's going to start off when you're at 20 corruption at about 20k DPS, or sorry, 20k per tick, which is a tick every 2 seconds, so half this much DPS. But if you're up at 80 corruption, this is going to be ticking on you for 80,000 damage, which is pretty substantial. Obviously, we're going to have a little bit more health next patch, but this will be pretty lethal if you're in a fight where there's also other lethal damage happening at the same time. And again, if you're up at 80 corruption, the radius of this thing, if you're at 80 corruption, is massive, right? Here's a look at what it procs like. This is a 90 corruption proc. These are target dummies. You'll see it's a 30-yard radius, basically, at that point. Whereas at 20 corruption, it's pretty small, right? You could get out of this pretty easily. And then, yeah, so here's 30 corruption, 40, 50, 60, 70, and 80. And it's, yeah, so at a bigger level, it will be more damaging and a bigger radius. So that this probably not a huge deal again until you start picking up more than like 40-ish corruption and you're starting to look at a void zone of this size that's also starting to really hurt. But this 20 corruption one, it's both a small area, so it's probably easy to get out of, and if you can't get out of it, it's not going to do too much damage to you anyway. Alright, once you reach 40 corruption, you gain the Grand Delusions debuff, which procs also once per minute. Taking damage has a chance to summon a thing from beyond, which pursues you for 10 seconds, and its speed increases with further corruption. We're not entirely sure how this thing's going to work yet, but it seems like it's going to be pretty bad if it reaches you, and we'll see exactly what happens then. And the speed is something that we'll need to test also. Again, once you're starting to get above this 40 corruption range, it starts looking like the corrupted zone is going to be a problem, right? And you could see like, okay, there's a void zone on the ground you don't want to run in. You might also be slowed from your grasping tendrils, and then an enemy spawns that's going to chase you and kill you if it reaches you. So these sort of all combo together, and as you get to these higher corruption levels, really bad stuff can happen to you. When you have more than 60 corruption, you gain the Creeping Death debuff. This will always be on you. It increases your damage taken by a percentage and reduces your healing received by a percentage. So 60 is this breakpoint where at 60 corruption, you start getting a 10% damage taken and healing received reduction, which is really, really painful. And as you get more corruption, every point of corruption above that will increase this by 1. So as soon as you get to 150 corruption, you are going to be healing immune, which seems like a pretty bad thing to happen. It's tough. It's tough to see what's going to happen here, but I think that you're going to want to avoid this for Mythic rating. I think that Mythic rating, the absolute most corruption you're going to want is 59, and I think that 39 is actually the most reasonable. Like, I think 39 is probably the amount above which you're really starting to push it for progression, because at 39 corruption, right, you're going to be spawning this void zone, but you won't have the thing from below chasing you. Or sorry, the thing from beyond. If the thing from beyond is chasing you and you're having big void zones and you're getting slowed, that seems like a pretty serious drawback. Now, what about these positive affixes, right? If you're taking on tier 3 bonuses, which are the big, strong bonuses, you can only really take 2 of those items before you're at 40 corruption, right? Unless you have some corruption resistance. So maybe the better thing to do is going to be to get a bunch of tier 1 items for progression rating that you try and roll the 5 on, right? You're hoping to hit these low ends of the tier 1 corruption range, because a lot of these effects are pretty, like, the stat ones are twice as good at tier 3, but this crit damage one, I feel like tier 1 crit damage is going to be a really good place to be. It's a really good balance of low corruption and high damage. So my expectation is that for progression rating, this is going to be the main best thing. Now, obviously, there's no way that we know of to target what thing is going to drop here. So there was a lot of RNG involved in this. And that, I think, is the big... If you've been reading Twitter, a lot of people's complaints about the system have been the huge amounts of RNG associated with it, which I think is a reasonable complaint. But it's also... This seems like a really interesting system. It seems like there's going to be a lot of new and interesting decisions you can make about how much corruption to take on, what items are worth wearing for the amount of corruption. I think it's really important that these things drop often so that you'll actually have multiple corrupted items in your bag and you're actually able to make these choices. If you only get like 1 corrupted item per week, as you kind of do with Titanforging these days, then it'll be pretty boring because you're basically going to look at an item and you're not actually going to make all that many choices with your gear, right? But if you got a bunch of these different corrupted items and you can kind of make different sets and figure out like what the best way to take on corruption is going to be, that seems like it's going to be pretty cool. One thing worth noting as well is that there is a string in the game that cleanses items of corruption. It's unclear what exactly this is going to involve. My suspicion is that this will remove both the negative and the positive things from the item, but there might be a way to remove just the corruption, or there might be a way to lower the amount of like corruption within a tier on an item so you can, you know, maybe move it towards that lower end of the range that we were talking about. These are all things that remain to be seen. But I think that this is actually going to lead to a much more interesting itemization system in WoW than we've had before. It's going to be a lot harder than just like simming yourself. You're not going to be able to, you know, just plug your stuff into a simulator and it'll tell you what does the most damage, because if you put on all the stuff that's going to do the most damage, you're going to die, right? You're going to have like 90 corruption and you're going to take 40% increased damage and receive 40% reduced healing. Like, This is a huge drawback, actually. The fact that this is damage taken and healing reduction is massive. You basically can't move into this range for progression rating. Once you're on farm, you can maybe get away with this, and this will be a cool way to do some absurd stuff on farm. But during progression, I think you really have to stay away from this. So I'm looking forward to the system. I think it looks pretty cool. I am worried about the RNG. I'm worried that if they don't correctly implement this, we'll end up with like an awful amount of RNG where you're just like, there's only a couple item rolls that would be good for you, and you just are never getting an upgrade because you're just trying to roll these like, low ends of corruption, and like one of these affixes only, and everything else is a downgrade, and there's no way to target the things you want. We'll have to see exactly what the specifics of the system are, but for now it looks pretty cool. So hope you enjoyed this little video. Thanks everybody for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.